Leader of the Opposition to kick off Opposition Bench. Hear, hear.
Our case is very simple. This will lead to a power struggle within Russia. There will be immense amounts of violence. There will be different factions vying for control of the Russian state. Millions of people will die that did not have to, and that is why we would not do this. Firstly, let me talk about why Putin is a known commodity, somebody who is predictable, somebody who we uniquely can work with. And this will take out opening government, because so much of their case is about how historically Putin has been kind of a bad dude. But our sense is that compared to the other likely leaders of Russia, there are certain factors of Vladimir Putin which make him the unique person that you would want to be at the head of the Russian state at the current time. Number one, Putin is, I think, actually a fairly rational actor. If you look at the decision to invade Ukraine, yes, obviously he has certain ideological tendencies. There are also, that can be explained in a very rational way, responding to internal pressure from within Russia, responding to economic reasons to want to take control of Ukraine, like control of gas and transport lines. Secondly, he's a known entity, so that is to say, number one, there are individual relationships that other countries' leaders have with Vladimir Putin, so you do not have with other individuals like Sergei Lavrov, for example, to a great extent. Secondly, there are existing lines of communication between Putin's Kremlin and other countries like the USA, for example. So Putin currently talks with the USA over the deployment of nuclear weapons because he's rational. He wants to make sure there is not actually going to be a deployment of nuclear weaponry as well. Thirdly, I actually think he's fairly, his actual demeanor in terms of a statesman is not quite as volatile as side-opening government makes out. So for example, he has done things like in the past threaten nuclear weapon, use of nuclear weapons. He's always pulled back from the brink. He's done things like come to the negotiation table over deals with how grain is transported through the Black Sea. There are a series of empirical and historical reasons that demonstrate he's not quite as volatile as I think side-opening government makes out. And all of that's really important because they try to claim that he's some unique evil. We flip this and explain how he's uniquely competent, uniquely predictable, and that is what is important. Secondly, in this speech, though, why do we think it is likely that you don't just get like Navalny becoming the leader of Russia, and actually you do get the likely alternative of a power vacuum? Firstly, let's take out this Navalny claim, because this is literally the stance of government bench, which is that you get Navalny instead. Number one, he's in prison, so I think number one, he probably just gets assassinated immediately. Like, he can't run anywhere. Number two, even if Navalny gets parachuted in by the United States military coming into Ukraine and Russia and making Navalny the leader, there are quite a lot of revanchist, nationalist people in Russia who are just in the middle of it, as OG claims, a propaganda state. I'm going to want Navalny to become their leader. I think that's likely. But thirdly, though, in terms of the US intervening and coming in and installing whoever they want, Russia is not a nation democracy that is has no institutions and it's not developed. This is a developed country with an existing set of politicians and political factions within it. Incredibly unlikely. Why do we think a power struggle is the most likely alternative? Number one, there is a series of people within Russia at the moment who would be vying for power. It's things like Lavrov, who I talked about earlier, but it's the leaders of the security state, it's the leaders of the Russian armed forces. Why do we think it is likely that they exist and they're willing to take power? Number one, I would say intuitively, dictators tend to want to assemble weird, kind of unclear hierarchies underneath them. So there's no individual person who is the likely successor. It's a lot of people who aren't really sure if they're going to be able to take power. Because Putin doesn't currently want anyone to become so powerful, they can get over him in terms of power. But number two, you want people to be uncertain about how much power they have, so they don't pull a Prigozhin and try to storm Moscow, right? The second thing I would say under this point is to make out the different reasons why you would immediately storm the capital of Russia and try to take control if you are people like Lavrov or the leader of the RAF. Reason number one is that you would fear that your enemies would take control other than you, and you would get purged, and your family would get purged, and all of your loved ones would immediately die. That is a strong, approximate reason why you specifically want to take power and need to take power, and will do it in the most violent way possible, because that is what it would take to make sure you guarantee this. Number two, control is obviously very lucrative. You control Russia now. You have quite a lot of assets because Russia is an oligopolic state. But thirdly, the people who are currently the leaders of Russia, obviously you have selected for particularly violent, particularly heinous individuals for all the reasons side opening government tells you about the history of Russia. It's the sort of people who would likely have a power vacuum, power struggle, and be happy with that. What are the implications for this, and why is this impact so big that no other team in this debate could potentially get over it? But before that, happy to take a point from closing if they have one, and if not, opening. Cool. Implications of this. Number one, during the resultant power struggle, it will be unclear who takes control of the nuclear weapons within Russia. Nuclear weapons are stored in multiple places within Russia. There are strategic and tactical nukes stored in various locations. At the point you have different mercenary groups, different armed forces rampaging through the Russian countryside. It is incredibly unclear who controls these weapons, which means, number one, other states cannot properly track them and understand who is currently in control of them. And number two, at the point you get somebody like Lavrov in charge, I think it is unclear specifically how they are going to be using these nuclear weapons, whereas I think we have a clear understanding of the precedent of what Putin would do. Yes?
Who's likely to take power after Putin eventually dies?
It is one of the three people that would be vying for power. We don't have an official stance as to which specific person is likely to be. We think there's going to be a power vacuum, and all of them are bad. And in fact, they're going to be worse than Putin for a series of structural reasons. Number one, you want to appear strong because you want to be a strongman leader of Russia. But specifically, you want to be stronger than Putin. You don't want to do things like immediately walk back the Ukraine war, because you will be seen as weak and a failure and weaken the person who came before you, and lead to other people attacking you and attacking your position. Number two, you want to continue doing things that are incredibly militaristic, because they do things like swell the amount of money that goes towards the military, which allows you to take control of the country and become a dictator because you have a security state that is incredibly well funded as well. Thirdly, it's very likely that now you are seen, that Putin is now seen as a martyr. You are now the person who has come in, and Putin has died and been killed in what the Russian people have been told is not an aggressive war, when the United States and other countries have been talking so much crap about how they're not going to invade Russia and they're only going to stick to Ukraine's turf. Now Putin is seen as a massive martyr, so the next person has no incentive to walk back to Ukraine. At least on our side, there is a good chance that either Ukraine wins the war, it fizzles out, they get their Bradley and Leopard tanks, their counteroffensive is successful, they go to the negotiation table, and the war ends. That is the likely alternative on our side. The likely alternative on their side is millions of people within Russia and elsewhere will die because of the power struggle. And that is why we oppose this.
Welcome up the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to conclude the opening half. Hear, hear.
Putin was bad, but we never heard a reason why things could not get worse, and they absolutely would, which is why opening opposition wins this debate. Firstly, I'm going to explain why it is that Putin was in no regards uniquely bad, and then go through the two ways we win this debate. Firstly, by explaining that successor would definitively be much worse, would escalate the conflict in Ukraine, and would escalate oppression of Russian people. And secondly, to explain that the power struggle that would occur in the short term would be so devastating, it would be orders of magnitude worse than anything that occurs in the status quo right now. Let's firstly deal with the issue of Putin. Side-opening government relies on the idea that he's a unique evil in the world. They give you 3 reasons to believe this. Firstly, that he's killed millions of people. 2, that he is a dictator. 3, that he has ideological views. This sounds like every dictator anywhere. This is true of Assad. This is true of MBS. This is true of many leaders around the world. No explanation as to why these facets are unique to Putin, and in particular, no reason as to why these are unique to any likely alternative that would exist, considering the past leaders that Russia has had have done all of those things, but worse. Stalin has done worse. Khrushchev has done worse. Brezhnev has done worse. No explanation as to why they have not engaged in ideological conflict, killed millions of people, engaged in dictatorship and domestic repression, all of which is still true. We explained to you that Putin is someone we are quite certain will avoid a nuclear holocaust. Is someone we are quite certain we can negotiate with. We are quite certain will not do something unpredictable. And Arin gives you a bevy of reasons why this is likely. His rationality, the fact that we know him, the fact that we have relationships with him, the fact that we have specific lines of communication, the fact that he at least has some level of stability in his power that means that he can afford to be cautious, can afford not to immediately jump the gun on something like nuclear conflict when a weaker leader who is involved in a power struggle, who has just established them, would not be able to, which explains why Putin was not that bad. Who did we explain was very likely to be the successor? We said that there were a variety of different people who could come to power, but that each of them has reasons why they would be worse as a result. Because, having just established them, the things that they would need to do are look strong. And how do you look strong? It is not doing an immediate about-face on the policy of your predecessor that makes you look weak. It makes you look like you have to, that you aren't as strong as the previous leader. If anything, you'd be forced to escalate. It looks like, for example, needing to martyr your previous leader. Because a classic way of coming to power is claiming that you're going to fulfill the struggle of your predecessor. That only I am capable of doing what Putin wanted to do, and my rivals are not, which is why I am the true successor. I am Putin's man. I am the guy who will unite Russia and invade Ukraine. Which is, again, why you're very likely to escalate. But thirdly, it's because you need to keep the military and security services on side because, 1, the war has drastically increased the budgets of the leaders of the military and security services. 2, it has given them a large number of additional emergency powers. And 3, it's given them far more capacity to do all of the things that they want, far more priority and prestige within Russia. And considering those are the backers that keep you in power, that it's the military, that it's the security services that mean that you aren't assassinated, that mean that you aren't overthrown, those are exactly the people you'll be forced to cater to. Dictators have their own patronage networks that they must maintain if they want to stay in power, and that means that you will need to escalate. You will not be able to look back. Their counterprops to this make no sense. What do they tell you? Firstly, they say, well, Navalny could just be a successor. 3 responses. Firstly, we explained it's very likely plans are already in place for him to be assassinated should anything happen to Putin, and it's in the interest of every rival to have him killed, for the reason that he's an obvious threat to their power. He's a challenger for the reasons OG says, so you would immediately kill him if possible. Secondly, he has no political backing because no military or security service group would benefit from him coming to power. Democratization means less power for the military. Democratization means they go to the ICC. Democratization means they're purged. They would never support that because it was never in their interest. But thirdly, his association with the West, just like their claims of intervention from the West, would never stand. No one in Russia would ever accept the US interfering in their country. Decades of propaganda have told them to hate the US. There are many legitimate grievances that can be pointed to for why they should hate the West, which is exactly why no one would tolerate it. No one in the military would allow it. And that is exactly what is likely to result in something like a preemptive nuclear strike, when there's a fear that Russia is literally being invaded by the United States. The troops are literally on the ground, and that it's literally going to result in foreign takeover of that country. That would never be tolerated. It would never be allowed. So that explains why the successor is definitively going to be worse, definitively going to escalate conflict, takes out opening government from the debate. Closing.
Who is most likely to do this and how?
So we explained it could be Sergei Lavrov, it could be Ramzan Kadyrov, it could be
the assassination.
The assassination. Could be anyone. We have no idea. Maybe they shoot him, maybe it's poison, maybe it's magic. We don't think it's particularly relevant to the debate how it occurs. We suspect it is very likely it'll be attributed to the US or Ukraine for the reason that they seem to have the most likely incentive, and that would be the easiest narrative to spin, and also very clearly explains why the immediate aftermath would be one of escalation. Think about, for example, in the aftermath of JFK's assassination, the lengths to which the USSR went to in order to mollify the US and prove they had nothing to do with it, because the risk that it would immediately touch off nuclear war, that it would immediately escalate that conflict. That is exactly the risk that is going to occur here, and it is unclear if those parties are involved, they would be able to distance themselves, or that Russians would trust them in that particular instance. But lastly, we explained to you that there's substantial harm. The power struggle in the short term is just devastating to everyone involved. Why? We explain dictators tend to create unclear, complex, and competing hierarchies because they need to pit their various, backers against each other, divide their power, keep them guessing about who is favored and who is not, and force them to compete against each other so they don't just topple the leader at any one point in time. Which means there's no clear chain of succession, which is why there's a vacuum, which is why there's a power struggle, which is why all the figures we talk of immediately come to the fore. But secondly, we explain they have an incentive to seize the throne. Opening government says, well, why would they do that? Well, maybe there's uncertainty or risk in doing so, but we explain why. Because at best, you go to the ICC when Navalny takes over, as they claim. More likely, your rival takes over, you're purged, your family's tortured to death, and horrible things happen to all your backers. The risk of you not seizing the throne is that the person you hate and trust the least seizes the throne, and they do terrible things. But secondly, we're pre-selecting for people who love power, who love prestige, and this is a chance at having the maximum amount possible. They say maybe you flee, but we explain where do you flee to if you're Valery Gerasimov. You will never be safe, you will always be hunted, you definitely won't live in luxury, and the comparative is being dictator of Russia. Also, these people probably have ideological commitments to believe that they must take over, that it's their duty to do so, and that they must not abandon the Russian people. They say there would be no preparation for this. These figures have been planning for this their whole lives. They know at some point Putin's going to die. They know at some point there's going to be the potential for a power struggle, and they worry that they will come out the worst for it, which is why they think about it. They say, why would this conflict involve any bloodshed? Because you have to seize infrastructure, military bases, TV and radio, power plants, cities, etc. Look at Libya, look at Sudan, look at South Sudan. Every civil war between competing factions touches off exactly this way, which is why what they say does not make sense. This risked nuclear war, it risked civil war, it risked the death of millions or billions. We win the debate.
15 years after World War II, there was a poll circulated amongst people as to whether they would go back in time and kill Hitler. A lot of the people assessed in this poll were Holocaust victims. A lot of the people assessed in this poll were victims of war. But despite all of those things, overwhelmingly people were against the very idea of murder. This is a debate that has lost empathy. This is a debate where people have lost their hearts and they trade lives on a chessboard. We are the side that adheres to the intuition of the ordinary intelligent voter. If you ask someone on the street, should you assassinate someone, their very basic response, removed of any other consideration, is that murder is wrong. And a targeted assassination is a policy that no side should ever have to countenance. Our extension will be explaining why the act of murder is wrong. I have 3 reasons for this. I've made very sure that all 3 of them are highly non-contingent. The first thing to say is that life is obviously a basis for all rights. Without life, you don't have function, you can't enjoy any of the other privileges for which life is a prerequisite for. The second thing to say is that murder is a violation of the relational foundation on which society is built, which is to say that society is built on intrinsic and self-evident understandings of respecting each other's agency. And when you murder someone, you take away that agency and you take away that sense of relation. And the thing to say here is that a lot of what Gov might say is, well, Putin already broke that social contract because he killed people first, so surely murder is just like open season, right? That is not true for the reason that ethics should be aspirational, right? You don't react in the way of ethics. You don't say, well, I'll only be nice to you because you were nice to me first. Obviously, to act ethically, you should be ethical as a sense of principle and as a sense of proactivity. That is why one of the most key ethical concepts, things like the golden rule, take the statement that you should do unto others what you want others to do on you. It is what you want of others to do on you, not what they have done of you on reality and how you react to that. The third reason is that no singular actor within this debate, whether it's a person, whether it's a state, or this house, whoever this house is, has the right to determine how or why or when someone else should die. That is for 3 reasons. Firstly, no actor has perfect information on somebody, and that is the basis for which government tries to justify this murder. That apparently he's murdered people, that apparently, he's a bad influence. But as opposition correctly identifies in the counterfactual world, there are a number of other alternatives that demonstrate he might have been a more benevolent leader than a set of other people. We don't know. We don't know what they did. We don't know what happens after death. We don't know anything about this person. Secondly, there is no incorruptible perfect actor, unless you are Jesus, who has the moral capacity to make that decision, because any actor is relatively imperfect in terms of their moral intuitions, and therefore cannot accurately make an assessment of whether they want to make the final irreversible decision that someone should die. That is the very basic reason why we've outlawed the death penalty, despite all the utilitarian arguments you could make about why the death penalty is good. Thirdly, morality is somewhat entirely constructed and relative, obviously. Like, morality is not a natural science. Now, understand this opens the Pandora's box, because God might say, well, if morality is all relative, why is it wrong to murder? In this case, we would apply the precautionary principle, which is that in the instance where we are unsure of the morality that we should go upon, we should not take the route or action that cuts off all forms of recourse in the sense of morality, because which is another basic justification of the death penalty, which is that in the future we might have more information, and at the point at which you haven't cut off that person's agency, you haven't cut off all forms of recourse, because you haven't murdered them in cold blood, you have the ability to make those amends. Now, all of those reasons are obviously non-contingent, but I want to explain 3 frames as to why this is more non-contingent than it should be, but I don't know why non-contingency should exist on a spectrum. I guess it's just like persuasiveness to the ordinary intelligent person. Firstly, I would say there is an act-omission distinction, and this is an intuition that the average person holds quite strongly, which means that Gov cannot trade this off by being like, we prevent deaths. We know this because if you do a survey of average people, and you do the trolley problem, for example, where people are willing to sacrifice lives, but then you do the fat man problem of like, would you throw a fat guy off a bridge in order to stop the train? People overwhelmingly are like, no, I would not do that. People believe that there is something wrong in doing an act. And I think that is probably tied to the thing I said before, which is like, maybe you think it is justified that someone should die, and maybe if someone happened to like walk and trip over and die, that is something that might not be so unfortunate, but people don't have the right or the meaning to take that person's life away. So this house as an actor feels like they should not do that, even if the taking of that life is something that leads to good outcomes. Secondly, this rights are only legitimate insofar as they enforce without practical consideration. If there is even a single instance where someone's rights have been taken away in justification of any reason whatsoever, it undermines the absolute protection rights afford people in every single instance for the rest of time. And thirdly, the morality of society generally is highly against the idea of trading off lives. We see this in things like the story of the dystopia of the Mellors. We see this in every major world religion that sees murder as the #1 and cardinal sin. We see this in Jewish sayings that say, save one life, it is as if you've saved all of humanity. We see this when there's widespread condemnation of the planned economies of Stalin and Mao, who justify themselves by saying, well, we made a life trade-off. We starved, 10 million people so we could save 30 million people. Those are the kinds of things that every single person opposes. I cannot understand, or I cannot fathom why they'll make a particular distinction just because the mere practical circumstances of this particular death is something they find themselves a bit more comfortable with within their hearts. Lastly, I'm going to explain the importance of this, but before this, I'll take openings.
Most people are utilitarians. They would kill one person to save 1,000 people, and given the novels are actually shooting Putin, obviously the ordinary intelligent voter would support him being assassinated by, like, the US or Ukraine.
So obviously this house is the actor, so this house is the actor that is killing Putin. The other thing to say is that it is totally false that people are entirely utilitarian. Literally just look at the Age of Ultron, or the plot of any large blockbuster movie is there is a villain, and in order to make them complex and seem understandable, they say, well, there is a utilitarian justification, and the hero is like, fuck you, that is wrong, even though you have that utilitarian justification. Lastly, why is our extension the most important in this debate? As you have already seen from this debate, everything else is highly speculative. That is firstly because this is a very unprecedented event. Secondly, there is an information vacuum because Russia exists in a black box of news. And lastly, there's a number of complex variables that are very chance sensitive. We don't know what will happen in the coup, who will shoot who, that means that who will capture which room, which leads to someone being successful in a coup, or the complex chains of reactions and butterfly effects that come from a single person's action. The murder of a man in cold blood is the only thing that is concrete and a salient harm that is proven within this debate. For these reasons, and for the hearts of humanity, is very proud to oppose.
All right. We have no idea how many people will die unnecessarily if Putin stays in power. Equally, we have no idea how many people will die if Putin is assassinated. The one person, however, that we do know will die as a consequence of this motion is Vladimir Putin. Born in St. Petersburg in October, son of Vladimir and Marina, father to Maria and Marina, a human soul, just like the rest of us. This is the most important and certain impact, don't laugh, this is serious, impact in the debate, and it is clearly debate winning. I'll do two things in this speech. Firstly, I'll explain why the extension is non-contingent and therefore supersedes everything else in this debate. And secondly, I'll provide a rebuttal contribution that will flip the closing government argument and therefore provide another practical outcome, even if you don't believe in the principal one. Firstly, why is our extension debate winning? The answer here is very clear. It's because it's the most certain contribution in the debate. Self-evidently, we know that Putin will die, but importantly, every other action in this debate is of very high consequence, but it's totally unclear in which direction that outcome will fall. And I think as debaters, we should have a greater level of intellectual humility about our capacity to predict the consequences of the actions that we suggest that we should take. Because how many times have you, in a debate, predicted something wrong or said that something would happen, and then the opposite ended up happening? How confident are you that you can predict in a matter of an hour, with a discussion between 8 university debaters, what will happen as a consequence of a serious geopolitical action with massive consequences on the rest of the world? I just don't think we can, which means that every other action in this debate is totally unclear. It could be great for the world, it could be terrible, but the consequences are so high, we think you should not act, and you should save the one person whose life we know that we can save, which is Vladimir Putin. How should you weigh this? I think you should ask yourself, what would you have as a threshold, as at least a vague proxy of the ordinary intelligent voter for when it is okay to take another person's life? I think the gut intuition of all people is that we require absolute certainty. You have to know for absolute certain that this will have positive impacts on the rest of the world, otherwise you would not find it conscionable to take the action of taking another person's life. And to the extent you have even the smallest amount of uncertainty about what the conclusion of the opening half is, or if you have any sort of panel discussion at the conclusion of this debate about who should win the debate, I think that's a pretty clear indicator. The outcome is obviously uncertain. And as a consequence of that, you should choose not to take any action at all. This applies both to Putin's life, and it also applies to everyone else's life who might be taken. That is, we have no idea whether this will involve also killing many Russian people when there is a fight between who takes over from Putin. We have no idea if this will kill many Ukrainian people as a consequence of what this does to the war in Ukraine. We don't think we should take any action. Next then, let's make this rebuttal contribution. The extension from closing government is that this will get pinned on Ukraine, and that's good because it will boost morale. And there's a piece in Dan's extension where he says that no other nuclear actor, they would never do a nuclear strike against Ukraine because that would be unviable, they would get nuked back. What I'll do here is flip this and therefore provide a positive contribution about why this results in a nuclear strike on Ukraine, and that would be terrible. Firstly, why is it that Ukraine would get hit by a nuclear strike, or there would be motivation to do so? The first intuition here is that the person who replaces Putin is extraordinarily likely to be someone from the military. That is, they are the person who is most capable of restoring some level of power after Putin is gone. They have access to something which gives them a foundation on which to build future power. They have the most capacity to kill and take over from other people who are vying for that power, which suggests that they are someone who has access to nuclear weapons, control and influence over the people who have the keys to those nuclear weapons, and have the sort of upbringing that would lead them to be prone to being okay with the nuclear strike, or the belief that retaliation is necessary in response to a grievous action against the state of Russia. And it also suggests that that person has a strong sense of nationalism. They care about Russia, they believe in its dignity, and they believe that its dignity has been violated at the point where a country that is small like Ukraine has cut off the head of Russia and removed its leader. But secondly, I think any other kind of response, or another way of engaging in a retaliation, for the reasons that closing government concedes, would not be effective or would not be possible. That is, they identify themselves that all the troops that are currently in Ukraine are already in Ukraine, and all the bombs that can be dropped on Ukraine, other than nuclear bombs, are already being dropped on Ukraine, which suggests you can't take any more decisive action than Russia would have already taken in the status quo. And after the death of Putin, all of these troops, as they say, would be demotivated, and therefore it's unclear you can launch a further strike unless they want to go back. You want to go back on that claim. So the only way to stop a turn in the war in Ukraine is to take decisive and aggressive action, like a nuclear strike. And we think this replacement would not want to begin their legacy by permitting the murder of Russia's beloved head of state to go unpunished, to allow the dignity of the Russian state to be violated, to allow it to succumb to a much smaller and much weaker nation which they believe to be less than themselves. Next then, let's talk about why they would not be afraid of another country then nuking Russia in response. The first reason for this is obviously Ukraine itself has no nuclear weapons and therefore would not be able to do that nuclear strike. And they are the ones who are probably the most motivated to do a nuclear strike back, and they obviously just don't have the capacity to do so. Which then means it requires another nuclear actor to, on behalf of Ukraine, engage in a nuclear strike against Russia. And it's fairly easy to understand why the decision calculus of the average leader would err very clearly and certainly on the side of not nuking Russia. That is, they have two paths in front of them. One option is to nuke Russia, which will definitely result in them getting nuclear strike back. Their own citizens will die, their own citizens might despise them for the reason that they unnecessarily killed Russian civilians in a war they had no stake in. They will definitely receive extreme consequences. Before I run out of time opening.
If certainty is the only way to justify death, OG explains why Putin is certainly evil. Even if the alternative is unclear, do you not have an obligation to remove evil from the world?
No, you don't, because I think the value of Putin's life is endogenous to him as a person, not what he chooses to do with that life for the reason Dave explained. But also, this is another certain harm, evil in the world, if I prevent its nuclear strike. So then let's go back to the decision tree that faces these leaders. We obviously, it's obviously clear that, well, if you nuke Russia, you get nuked back. But what is the other alternative? Choosing not to engage in a nuclear strike against Russia. That would almost certainly result in you being fine. It's pretty clear that the reason why Russia has nuked Ukraine is because Ukraine assassinated Putin, and given you did not assassinate Putin, it's unclear why they would then engage in a nuclear strike against you. So the decision to not nuke Russia definitely and certainly protects your own citizens, prevents your country from getting nuked, and probably on a larger scale protects the entire world from descending into nuclear warfare, which means I think Russia is fairly certain that if they do a nuclear strike against Ukraine, they will be safe. But they will be safe. So the only reason then why Ukraine hasn't already been nuked is probably because Putin knows that if he did that, it would finally give his own citizens the reason to engage in revolt, to finally overthrow his government, to make one of his other leaders below him actually assassinate him and then take power in its place. But that changes at the point where the people of Russia and the people who take over from Putin demand a nuclear strike. The impact of then this is clearly the biggest in the debate. Millions of Ukrainians will die, nuclear winter will fall over Ukraine and Europe, meaning millions of more people starve, and the Pandora's box of nuclear warfare against non-nuclear powers is open. This is a far larger harm than instability, it's a far larger harm than getting a benefit than getting morale. We should avoid a nuclear strike against Ukraine, which this would certainly cause.